I found myself, I don't know if I chose to, but I found myself writing songs about violent subjects more than romantic subjects. I mean, now and then I like to think I have, you know, some good-hearted romantic impulses and express them in songs, but for the most part, I write a different kind of song.
Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio.
Warren Zevon called himself Mr. Bad Example. His life was one, and his songs had many more. He saw plenty of guns, alcohol, and money in his life. Also, monkeys and skulls. Between bouts of crippling alcoholism, the rock and rolling singer-songwriter had an interest in the pulp fiction parts of life, the undesirable elements of humanity his songs focused on. There is a reason his mascot and personification was Mr. Velvet Nose. A skull and glasses, smoking a cigarette, Zevon liked to sneak onto his album covers, a symbolic manifestation of his endless fascination with death. Nearly all of Warren's songs, at any point in his varied career, focused on some combination of death, disappointment, perversion, or monkeys. He really liked monkeys. His most famous hit was the hammy horror story, Werewolves of London, inspired off a hit of marijuana. His other songs ran the gamut from African decolonization to baseball players who endorse marijuana. Carmelita is about a strung-out heroin addict who is about to expire in a public park. Veracruz is based on the forgotten American Marines' occupation of Veracruz. Lawyers, Guns, and Money is exactly what it says. Play It All Night Long is a southern rock song which features brucellosis. It's a cattle disease. And the 1989 album, Transverse City, was an outright cyberpunk concept album. The variety and obscurity goes on and on. Then there is One. While not his greatest hit, it became Warren Zevon's most iconic song. It expressed all his morbid interests in a fiction only he could write. Roland The Headless Thompson Gunner, a dirge about the death and revenge of an African mercenary. Its existence ran parallel to his own life. The story behind Roland is as violent, surreal, and questionable as the song. Even after Warren Zevon's death in 2003, it continues. He would find that appropriate. The seeds for Roland grew implicitly from psychological scars planted deep in Warren's mind. He understood the song's ideas from childhood. While his parents, a mafioso and a Mormon, suffered a constant on-again, off-again relationship, Warren always remembered one picture from his childhood. A portrait of his maternal uncle, Warren Cope Simmons, hung in the living room. The dead soldier was an unspoken influence in his childhood. He never met his soldier uncle, but Warren credited him for an ingrained cynicism and sense of fatalism he had until his own death. It was music that gave him the outlet to express it, but his introduction to music was rather out of the blue. Warren's father, William Stumpy Zevon, had won a piano in a card game and gave it to Warren for Christmas. The boy took to the instrument with gusto. Classical music became the base of his musical career. Thanks to connections, the young Zevon ended up in a brief tutorship beneath the American conductor Robert Kraft, and with Kraft, spent time at the California home of Igor Stravinsky, the great Russian composer who Warren would have a brief acquaintance with. Though, later in life, Warren declared the relationships were passing and the education was largely informal. Still, Kraft and Stravinsky's influence were strong enough Warren dreamed of one day completing his own symphony. The idea would emerge infrequently in Zevon's career, but never came to anything on its own. Only a few sections would surface in his albums here and there. In high school, he would pick up the guitar to impress girls, but was always a pianist first. From there, his musical career would begin. While Warren was classically educated in certain terms, he was far from a snob. His songs always found their roots in literature. Writers like Ernest Hemingway, Norman Mailer, and Hunter S. Thompson, who Warren would have a brief friendship with, shared equal space in his mind with T.S. Eliot and Lord Byron. In the 80s, he even became obsessed with William Gibson's Neuromancer as well. Warren often described himself as F. Scott Fitzvaughn, in reference to the notorious alcoholism of American writer turned Hollywood dropout, F. Scott Fitzgerald, writer of The Great Gatsby. In Norway, Warren was referred to as the Rockabilly Ibsen due to dark similarities with the country's national dramatist and famous writer, Henrik Ibsen. though during his childhood, Warren's favorites were pulp dime store novels, detective fiction he always retained a taste for until his death, a flavor that always seeped into his songs in some manner. Zevon's style usually described as a sort of pop noir. Classical music, a slurry of literature, and a hard-boiled California lifestyle was a potent mixture for a musician, not helped by Warren's perennial alcoholism and a Hollywood environment where drugs were commonplace. Added to this was his own fascination with firearms. Pistols, revolvers, and machine guns often found their way into Warren's hands. On his 31st birthday, he bought a .44 Magnum, then immediately threw up upon returning home. He later, drunk, waved the gun outside a Bruce Springsteen concert as a joke. He was immediately tackled and nearly arrested. The gun eventually featured on the inner cover of Excitable Boy, and Warren's own Uzi can be found on the inner cover of Bad Luck Streak and Dancing School. Both images netted him no end of controversy, especially for their highly implied violence. With his sense of humor, though, he found both problems very funny. His musical career he approached with similar joking cynicism. When asked about his only mega hit, Warren reflected on his former fame. "I don't remember stardom with any longing. It was a brief opportunity to be rude. Fire that opening act. I don't like the way he looked at me. My success was a fluke. I was a folk singer who accidentally had one big hit." He was not lying. While often a writer for other acts behind the scenes, his single career started as a pseudo-folk singer with the album Wanted Dead or Alive under the moniker Zevon. It was a bomb. Warren later said it failed because he kept losing all the picks in his guitar. After the failure of Wanted Dead or Alive in 1975, the Zevons took a tour of Spain. Among the American expat community, Warren found a position working at a bar outside Barcelona in Sitges, Spain. For the next few months, Warren worked as the establishment's piano man and sometimes bartender. The Dubliner, while a favorite of tourists, had a questionable reputation. According to Warren, while he worked his shift, he sang no end of IRA anthems and Irish rebel songs. The bar was owned by a man known as David Lindell, an American, or maybe Irishman, whose business card read, "Former guerrilla and mercenary soldier." Zevon and Lindell immediately took a liking to one another. Lindell is perhaps the most fascinating and obscure character to ever be involved with Warren Zevon. His existence is poorly attested at best, but he seems to have been real enough. While the last name Lindell is of Swedish origin, he could have easily been either American or Irish, though due to his bar's Irish theme and the fact there were many more Irishmen in Africa during the period, Irish is more likely. As Warren worked the piano, Lindell would regale his employees and patrons with his experiences in Africa. Lindell's stories, often told while drunk, stimulated Warren's appetite for espionage. After a few weeks, the two began drafting songs together. The collaboration would result in the songs Nighttime in the Switching Yard and Roland The Headless Thompson Gunner. The first about a mysterious figure in a train yard, and the second about a deadly mercenary in Africa. After returning to America, though, Warren was notoriously tight-lipped about Lindell. His silence was likely due to Lindell's questionable background and the fact Warren, early on, often disliked divulging details. While Lindell received writing credits on 1978's Excitable Boy, many doubted his existence. Warren only added to the mystique around the song by avoiding questions about Lindell and who he exactly was. While the bar owner's fate after the 1970s is unclear, there is some proof the Dubliner bar did exist, but it now appears to be defunct. It's unclear if there's any other successor establishment. Several other expats from the 1970s recall visiting the bar and its legendary owner David Lindell. The website Los Amigos supposedly has a picture, but its quality and origin is questionable. Roland the Headless Thompson Gunner was purely a product of Warren Zevon and David Lindell, though. The figure of Roland was a composite of Zevon's aesthetic and Lindell's experience in the African wars, mainly the events of the Congo Crisis and the Nigerian Civil War. The song is a murder ballad in the genre of soft rock that follows the mercenary figure throughout this chaos. The eponymous mercenary Roland, from the land of the Midnight Sun, Norway, travels to Africa to practice his killing trade. Historically, Roland would have been one of the many European veterans who traveled to Africa during the 60s and 70s to take up service for the newly independent African governments, fighting in Cold War conflicts of ideological and ethnic origin for pay. Roland and his brothers-in-arms do their deeds with Thompson guns. both a reference to Zevon's own Chicago gangster heritage and the fact mercenaries often had to make do with outdated weaponry in Africa. While the conflicts Roland and the others partake in are left vague and purposefully contradictory, the song states they are paid to help out the Congolese with their deadly trade. Roland and his cohorts are mercenaries to the bone. They commit violence for pay between 66 and 7. As Roland's gunmanship becomes famous across the Congo, the United States takes notice. To stop Roland, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, pays Roland's brother-in-arms, Van Owen, to murder him. Van Owen may be a reference to the mercenary commander, Hugh Van Oppen, a mercenary commander in Africa whose mysterious death is still unsolved to this day. Van Owen, though, the antagonist of the song, shoots down Roland in cold blood. The deceased, Headless Roland will not put away his trade, though. As the years roll on, Roland's ghost stalks the continent for revenge. He becomes the embodiment of strife and search for Van Owen. Even in death, he carries on as a mercenary. After years of searching, Roland Shade finds Van Owen, now implied to be a drunk, in a barroom in Mombasa. Just as Van Owen did to him, the Headless Roland shoots down Van Owen. The assassination by Thompson gun sends Van Owen's corpse flying, maybe literally, from Mombasa to Johannesburg, pronounced Johannesburg in some renditions. That's about 2,432 miles, 3,900 kilometers, across the lower half of Africa. Still not satiated, Roland continues, his lust for conflict grown beyond Africa. Roland's spirit stirs up bloodshed in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the Lebanese Civil War, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and the kidnapping of newspaper heiress Patty Hearst. Roland's phantasm wanders to this day, seeding conflict across the globe, just to continue his work. As the song repeats, time for another peaceful war, but time stands still for Roland till he evens up the score. Beside Lindell's own combat experience, the sources Warren Zevon could have found for the song in the 1970s were endless. Since the 1960s, news stations and papers had carried endless news about the events in Africa, some enamored by mercenary activity, others horrified by atrocities. Either way, many of these reports retained a pulpy air that would have attracted Warren's attention. The song is a synthesis of all the conflicts across Africa in the 60s and 70s. The most major are the many conflicts of the Congo Crisis and Nigerian Civil War. The years 66 and 67 refer to the tail end of the Congo Crisis and the start of the Civil, or Biafran War, in Nigeria, the flow of mercenaries from one conflict to the other. Roland's drifting across Africa was very common among the mercenaries who would later be called wild geese by the press. As a Times Magazine article, which it seems Warren read, concluded on October 25th, 1968, "It is not the land, either, for they seem to have no eyes for the green rolling infinity of the African bush, the visionary sunsets, the humming warm smoky nights. They are lobos, wolves, outcasts from society who fight every day in order to taste the excitement that comes in living close to violent death. If they survive Biafra, they will doubtless drift on in search of another war. Until then, their allegiance, temporary though it may be, is to Biafra." As is obvious, these many conflicts were incredibly complex. Almost too complex to simplify in any satisfactory manner. Wars and figures Warren Zevon drew upon for the song. Artistic license is inherent in any form of storytelling. The themes of war are omnipresent, though. The Congo Wars these mercenaries fought take them through 66-67. 1966-1967 puts the song during the last years of the Congo Crisis, though these years are not actually considered part of the main crisis. The Congo Crisis itself was not one event or battle, but a series of wars and rebellion during the decolonization of Africa. The withdrawal of Belgian troops from the Congo caused the near-immediate splintering of the newly formed Republic of the Congo. This led to the secession of the resource-rich state of Katanga in 1960, which brought the interference of the USA and USSR into the events. War broke out with both sides employing European mercenaries, largely former Belgian troops, though the Katangese forces mostly were mercenary commando trained. The United Nations would condemn the use of mercenaries, bringing about the mercenary question in global politics, but that did nothing. But, due to UN pressure and the presence of international troops, Katanga would collapse, but the Congo was still unstable. The next few years were chaotic. As the withdrawal of European empires created a vacuum, the United States and Soviet Union moved in. By 1963, the Congo found itself the next front in the developing Cold War. The United States backed the questionable government of the Congo, and the Eastern Bloc lent support to the insurgent Simba rebels. This would lead to the Simba Rebellion, where an insurgency seized large portions of the eastern Congo. Though billed by both sides as socialist radicals, the Simbas were more a disparate coalition of traditionalist warriors and Maoist rebels. Both sides saw extended use of foreign troops and mercenaries in the war. The Western powers employed former Katanga sympathizers, then Che Guevara showed up in the region with a Cuban force due to support from the Soviet Union. As the Simba offensive collapsed, though, and the Cubans abandoned the effort due to ideological divides with the Maoist rebel leaders, the rebel forces were defeated by 1965. This, though, segued into the end of the Congo crisis, though it is often considered its own event. The Stanleyville Mutinies, in 1966-1967, probably the direct inspiration for Roland the Headless Thompson gunner. A revolt in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where about 100 European mercenaries and 1,000 mercenary-trained natives mutinied in Kasangani, formerly Stanleyville, a city the former Katangi's commandos, supported by the Western powers, had won back from the Simba rebels. To make it clear, a segment of the mercenaries had gone from fighting the Congolese government to fighting for it to rebelling against it, all in the span of 6 or 7 years. Reminder, mercenaries are only loyal to their pay. When the unorganized mutiny was defeated and driven into Rwanda, that signaled the definite end of the Congo crisis, though not the end of conflict in the Congo. Another contemporary crisis in Nigeria should also be mentioned. The Nigerian Civil War, or Biafran War, was the cession of the Igbo state of Biafra from the government of Nigeria in 1967. The Igbo-dominated region of Biafra in the south of Nigeria controlled a majority of the country's oil supply, one of Nigeria's main exports. Nigeria being sharply divided between north and south. Unlike other ethnic groups, especially Muslim regions in the north, the Igbo were more open to British rule and education during colonization. During and after British control, the Igbo were in ascent across the colony. Ethnic resentment, though, led to fears of genocide. Post-independence, political malfeasance led to Biafra declaring independence, and Nigeria employing starvation as a weapon in the war against the rebel state. Though mercenaries were largely relegated to command and support roles after the affairs of the Congo crisis, Biafran forces did score a few victories, but political isolation and material scarcity led to the state's collapse, though no genocide ever truly manifested on a massive scale. All of this conflict set the backdrop for Roland, but there were more subtle influences. The mercenary Roland's fate, being shot in the head, may derive from the famous Mozambique drill, otherwise known as the failure to stop drill, a close-quarters combat strategy supposedly developed by Rhodesian mercenaries during the Mozambique War of Independence. The shooting technique is exactly what it says, intended to prevent a failure to stop. The gunman fires twice into the torso of the target, then once into the head. If any of the 3 shots hit, the enemy is either stopped in their tracks or outright dead. Due to the often cramped urban or jungle terrain of the African wars, the technique found ready usage among the migratory mercenaries. While the historical Roland was not a victim of the Mozambique drill, the historical Van Owen, or Van Oppen, might have been. Searching the name of mercenaries active in Africa during the 1960s, one finds 2 interesting names, the previously mentioned Van Oppen, and a figure known by the name Erickson. Hugh Van Oppen was a British mercenary commander who met with a controversial end in the Congo. After a series of disputes among his forces, Van Oppen was found dead one morning in 1966. He had been shot in the stomach, but still retained his head. While no one was ever arrested, and Van Oppen's assailant is still debated to this day, most blame Van Oppen's ambitious lieutenant, Lieutenant Ross Johnson. Though Ross Johnson always maintained his innocence, and there's a small chance Van Oppen may have accidentally fired his gun at himself while cleaning it. The dispute, though, eventually faded into just another element of mercenary lore. On the second figure, there is little info. Erickson, who was probably from Denmark, was the likely inspiration for Roland's Scandinavian background. Zevon had maybe learned about him from Lindell's stories. The Scandinavians served as the runner for the notorious mercenary commander and pseudo-celebrity Mad Mike Hoare. There is no doubt some of Mike Hoare's bombast contributed to Warren Zevon's drafting of Roland the Headless Thompson gunner. Equal parts famous and controversial as he was actor and soldier, Hoare was the mercenary figurehead of the 1970s. If anyone was representative of the era, it was Hoare. Hoare's career was half swashbuckling pirate mercenary and half nostalgic diehard of the last days of the British Empire. a former soldier who abandoned a life as an accountant to become an adventurer in Africa. Making use of his past combat experience in Asia during World War II and time as a safari guide in South Africa, Hoare peddled himself across the contentious regions of the continent. Eventually, Hoare came into contact with American diplomat and CIA agent Donald Rickard. Rickard and Hoare became fast friends. Soon Hoare, using his charisma to rise to the top of the mercenary chaff, was operating with the CIA's tacit permission, or friendly understanding, across Africa. The espionage was on. Hoare's legendary lust for adventure, and maybe a bit of the limelight as well, led to him becoming a major public figure at the time. He appealed to news agencies with a charismatic presence, thin anti-communist veneer, and British soldier of fortune charm that supposedly kept his troops in line. Hoare was more public icon than commander anyways. As he liked to say, he only put upon the role of a mercenary commander. He was good at acting at it. Thanks to his links with American intelligence agencies and masculine charisma, Hoare's forces, the Wild Geese as he called them, operated across the Congo and Nigeria. First employed against the Congo, then against the Simba rebels. David Lindell was likely among them. More than once was Hoare's charm able to convince UN forces to leave him unmolested, and Hoare's legally gray operations continued unabated. He always liked to claim he had personally fought Che Guevara in the Congo during the revolt, but that is unlikely. It is more probable a section of Hoare's forces engaged Guevara's Cuban commandos in the brief period, and it was likely only a brief skirmish at that. Supported by the CIA as an anti-communist partisan, it is no surprise Hoare adopted the moniker Mad Mike after East German radio denounced him as that mad bloodhound Hoare. Still, with their share of deserved controversy, Hoare and his wild geese captured the public imagination. The term wild geese for Hoare's men, and African mercenaries in general, originated from a patch Hoare wore on his uniform, but it had a historical precedent. It was a reference to both the migrations of wild geese across Europe and the historical Irish mercenaries called wild geese. Exiled Irish soldiers who wandered across Europe doing war for pay from the 1500s to the 1800s. Being of Irish descent, Hoare adopted the title. His forces, though, were composed of a menagerie of Italian, Greek, Belgian, Rhodesian, South African, Scandinavian, Irish, and native soldiers. Due to Irish missionary links with the Igbo and Biafra as well, there was no shortage of sympathetic Irish wild geese in reserve, ready to join the fray. Shared anti-colonial animosity led to support of Biafra by a variety of nationalities as a direct attack on the hated influence of the British Empire and British petroleum interests across the world. There was no lack of bizarre figures who floated around the circles of these wild geese or adjacent to them. Anyone, adventurer or outlaw, could make a quick buck fighting in Africa during the period. The German Rolf Steiner was Mike Hoare's German equivalent, but far more controversial. Steiner was, and is, a notorious tale-teller and exaggerator. During the last days of World War II in Germany, he has claimed to be anything from a Hitler Youth defending Berlin, to being thrown into a concentration camp for Jewish ancestry, to studying for the priesthood until he had improper relations with a nun and was kicked out. He was present, with a gun, for nearly every colonial crisis during the mid-1900s, known for his fervent denial of the term mercenary in favor of soldier of fortune. His brigade's motto was apparently "Long live death, long live war." Siegfried Müller, or Congo Müller, was a mercenary of similar extraction to Steiner. Müller was far more open about his time in the Wehrmacht during the 1940s, though. Unlike Hoare or Steiner, though, Müller was far more open about his killing. Whenever possible, he flaunted his Iron Cross. Best known for his 1966 interview on German TV, known as Der lachende Mann, or The Laughing Man, which is something to say the least. Don't watch it if you're unnerved easily. Outside Müller, there were other figures with nobler goals, but they were still mercenaries to the bone. August Martin, an American who died in the Nigerian Civil War, was a former Tuskegee airman employed by the Biafran government as one of its only pilots. Juan Correa, known as White Johnny to the Biafrans, was a Puerto Rican who found himself in service of Biafra. He was Biafra's only explosives expert and was sent out to the battlefield to retrieve Nigeria's unexploded, often jury-rigged ordnance. The Swedish pilot, Count Carl Gustaf von Rosen, was a mixture of humanitarian and mercenary for the cause. A crack pilot who operated across Africa during the period, he supplied the Biafran government with supplies during the Biafran airlift to support the war effort. One of the few individuals to be openly optimistic about the cause. With British adventurers, German soldiers, Irish mercenaries, and Swedish pilots, the affairs of Africa at the time seemed almost mythological. One last aspect to discuss about Roland the Headless Thompson Gunner is why the name Roland was chosen for the protagonist. Mythology, or folklore, may be the origin of Zevon's choice. One need only look to the Norwegian folk ballad Rolandskvedt, or The Lay of Roland.
Six mine sveine heime væra og gjøymede gulleballe. De are six på heidningsland og røyne de arn i kalde. Ria de ut ord Franklandet med dyre drås i sadel. Blæs i luren olivant på rusarvollen.
An adaptation of the chivalric French romance cycle, The Matter of France, into Norwegian verse. The song and poems tell the tale of pseudo-historical, pseudo-mythological Roland, one of Charlemagne's paladins, and his battle against the Saracen, Muslim invasion of southern France. While accustomed to folk music, and with Lindell's influence, it is not impossible Warren knew of the song. While not obvious at first, there is a tangible influence from the ballad. The most obvious tip of the hand being the mercenary Roland originates from Norway, the folk ballad's place of birth. Beyond the shared name, both songs are essentially death ballads. Rolandskvedt, or The Lay, tells of Frankish raids and wars on foreign lands such as Spain and northern Africa for riches. That is until the Muslim incursions into southern France. The paladins, Roland among them, are able to stave off the invasion until the Gascoignes, Basques, betray the Franks at the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass, or Roncesvalles Meadow in some versions. A symbol of chivalric honor to death, Roland refuses to surrender or call for help. With his legendary sword Delvedal, known as Durendal in English, Roland answered in anger, from him flowed blood and froth. I shall hew such a hew that they shall ask till judgment, or doomsday. Roland fights on until his sword breaks, or is worn down, to a long drill. Drill, eh? With Durendal broken, Roland has no choice but to take his Oliphant, a war horn sometimes known as a slug horn, and call for help. Roland sets the horn to his lips 3 times and blows it. The force needed, though, blows out his head and eyes, rendering Roland dead. The day is lost with Roland's death, but Charlemagne is made aware of the betrayal. Even if the connection is not direct, Roland is Roland's symbolic ancestor. Time has changed the chivalric paladin into an arbitrary mercenary, the legendary sword has become a machine gun, and the death and betrayal have been conflated. Both Rolands symbolically lose their heads, though. Both promise to bring forth bloodshed until the end of the world. Is this a stretch? Yeah, probably, but it is an interesting link to think about. For one measly ballad, the content behind Roland the Headless Thompson Gunner is dense. Warren Zevon truly was more of a folk singer than a rock star after all. Roland is the best example of his ability to synthesize 1,000 strands into a pulpy murder ballad. Warren would later return to the theme of African mercenaries in the song Jungle Work with a sort of 80s action movie flair, but it never matched Roland, nor was it intended to. There was something about Cold War jungle espionage that attracted him. Roland the Headless Thompson Gunner, song and character, is a tribute to Warren Zevon's talent and the reason it was the last song he ever performed live in front of an audience. Roland's ghost lives on forever. The opening piano riff stands representative of the song's immortality. It's immortal because it's so human, imperfect, and often covered, screaming in blood. Another will always set out to join the bloody fray.
Roland was a warrior from the land of the midnight sun, with a Thompson gun for hire and fighting to be done. The deal was made in Denmark on a dark and
Now that the war is truly over, I'd like to thank my patrons, The Single Way Out, and the Gel Samini family.